Welcome to our Manhattan Facebook Live. I'm John Mata, the chairman of our Manhattan. We have Ed McNamara, our producer here. And tonight we have Amy Convey, the Kansas State Board of Education District 1 candidate, who's joining us. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Thanks
So
for
why
having
don't
me.
you thanks for coming. Why don't we just start out and just tell folks just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, we moved to Kansas in 2016, and when my husband retired from a long career in the Air Force, and we've made this our forever home, not moving again. And so we have three kids and one grandson. And I decided to run for my local school board back in, let's see, 2021. I was always involved in my children's education, and uh, and then when everything happened with COVID, I decided to be involved at a greater level, right? And that's when I decided to run. So I served on my local school board. I serve now as my local precinct person. I also serve as the Kansas chair for the National School Board Coalition. That's an alternative, not to be confused with the National Association of School Boards, and it's an alternative to KESB in the state. And so I serve as the chair for that and help school board members across the country and the state. And then as a school board member, I introduced the first Parents' Bill of Rights in Kansas at a local level. That was after Governor Kelly vetoed the state legislature. We passed, or the legislature passed that, and then they didn't have the veto-proof majority. And Kelly said that should be handled at a local level, which they sometimes like to say when they don't want things to go through.
Uh,
So I said, well, okay. So we did that at Lansing, and I also been busy testifying on legislation at the State House and trying to work with legislators on that. And that's kind of how I ended up here. And now that Danny Zek, who has served the last 4 years for District 1, decided not to run, I put my name in. So, and I hope to serve Kansas.
Super. Yeah, I bet a lot of people aren't that familiar with the um, Kansas State Board of Education. So maybe
Hmm.
just talk a little bit about if you're on that board, if you're a member of the Kansas State Board of Education, what do you do?
Yeah, sure. Even some local people, once they found out that I was running, they're like, what does that mean? So that's a great question. They have the board has the general supervision, I'm sorry, of schools in the state and other educational institutions. And they have that general supervision, but they also appoint the state commissioner, which, if you've been following the news right now, the state commissioner of education is in the process of being selected by the state board. And so that's a very important duty, kind of like on a local level, how the board selects their superintendent. The
Intended.
state board does that too. They're also in charge of certification for teachers, counselors, administrators, which is very important because some states has shifted their criteria for that. For instance, for superintendents and whether they need an educational background, what's required, and also to make sure that teachers keep up their current licensing. We're in charge of all of that. We are also in charge of the accreditation of all schools, which is very important. We set the state standards, the course of study, the number of credits required for graduation, and what different areas are required for that. Libraries, educational materials for the schools we're in charge of, although at the local level they select their curriculum, but it's based on the state standards that the state board sets. And then one of the most important and sometimes neglected duty of the state board is to help administer the laws of the state concerning education matters. And that's very important because depending on which side you fall with some issues, some think that that hasn't been done to the full extent. So that's very important.
So, okay. Um, just in general, like, why are you running and what are your priorities as far as the State Board of Education?
Well, like I said, I served at a local level, and then I've been following legislation and following the state board and some decisions that were made. And now with the DOE potentially shifting the majority or all of the responsibility back to states, I feel the state board is going to be more important than ever. But I feel like we need someone that's very strong, that stood the test of being pressured by different sides to fall into the bureaucracy and to toe the line. And I think I'm a very strong leader. I've withstood criticism. I will do what I say when I get into office instead of how sometimes people magically change once they get that title, you know. And most importantly, we can't keep doing the same thing that we have been doing because it's not working. We need to make changes. You can't expect different results by doing the same thing. So I will be strong and dedicated. I'm willing to spend hours of time, days each month focused on this, training and doing what's best. And I feel like now is the perfect opportunity for me to jump into that.
So, okay, super. Going to get through. We have kind of a list of questions here. Actually, shared those with Amy ahead of time. A number of them, the vast majority of them, actually came from some online input we got regarding her candidacy. So we really like that. Also, if you're watching this and you have some questions, put them in the comments. We'll get them up. I see we've already got one that's out there. And so Ed will work those in as we go along. This next question is actually a question of mine, which we're going to be talking to, and we over you've talked to incumbents and people running for office. And I'm actually a little facetious question that I'm asking every candidate that comes
Mhm.
on. It's a yes no question, but you can just say yes or no, or you can say yes but or no but and give more explanation. Um, can men get pregnant?
Well, I'm not a biologist,
Uh-oh.
but I would say no.
No, okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah. In fact, that's kind of a running joke in my family. When I receive a lot of criticism, my husband kind of reminds me of that some of the people criticizing me actually think that men can get pregnant. So, no.
okay, we're not going to dwell on that, but it's
Yeah,
just what I'm going to ask everybody that we have come
yeah,
in because it kind of
sure.
sets the tone and knows where people are coming
Yeah.
from a certain respect. So, okay, we'll get into some of the questions. Like I said, this next series of them, and I'll say when we end that series, actually came from some online input that we got. So, is could you, in your own words, explain what critical race theory is? Which I think this is one of your items that you want to get out of schools if I
Yeah,
read some of your campaign material.
sure. Yeah, a lot of people have the idea that critical race theory doesn't exist in education because it's not listed on the standards or it's not listed in the curriculum or it's not a course that you take. CRT is and can be embedded in just about anything in a local school, from professional development training to curriculum to material that supplemental material that teachers bring in. But it is basically the inference that DI, like with DI by DEI, I'm sorry, that American society is inherently racist and that it's a systemic problem in the country that can't be overcome unless you dismantle the entire society, you know? And it's an oppressive system that has people that are oppressed and it's by white supremacy and that all the ills of America are attributed to that. And it's founded in the way that our country was founded, it's in our culture. And what they want to do is the goal of Marxism is to dismantle our systems that perpetuate that, right? So with CRT, how it can be embedded is if you use that for a lens to look at items, say like just teaching history, or it could be just about anything. It could, like I said, it can be in professional development training or anything.
I heard
You have
English
to really
classes
look
are a
into
big
that.
one that they're in.
Yeah, yes, English. is one that you can teach a certain, say, like you're trying to teach writing, for instance, right? So the teachers need to follow what the state standards are, and but they can use whatever material they want. So they can pull supplemental material. And locally in Lansing, we actually had an entire 8 week course just on social justice, which had so much critical race theory embedded in it, but it was all under the guise of teaching a writing course for high schoolers. And you could still teach that writing course without that unit, but that's what was chosen to do. We ended up removing that unit, and that's what I think needs to happen with curriculum across the state.
So, okay. Next one is a little bit of a strange question. Will you be firing people within your staff to exercise their First Amendment rights to free speech? In other words, I think this question is saying if someone uses their free speech, are you going to fire them? I don't know if you have that much hiring or firing
Yeah.
duties in this job, but the
Yeah, exactly. Well, for one, just like as at a local level, the state board can only act if you have the majority of the board members. So not one single board member can fire anyone, but our main employee will be the state commissioner of education. So we're not involved in the daily hirings and firings on the district level. And any action as far as any staff that works for the state board, say like legal or even a secretary, that's all decided on by the majority of the board. So no. And then also one thing with that, as far as the First Amendment, that's kind of used as an excuse by some that it would protect all employees. That's been in the news a lot. For instance, when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, but employees in general have the right, or employers have that right to set forth parameters as far as their employees' behavior, and they have that right to be able to fire them too when it's listed in their employee manual. So some people don't quite understand that and use the First Amendment as a guise to just be able to say whatever you want, whenever you want. But as a state board member, like I said, we really have the one employee.
yeah, I think that's an important point, though, that because we hear that, we do hear that all the time. Oh, it's my First Amendment. It's my First Amendment. It's
Hmm.
like, yes, you have your First Amendment to say whatever you want. You don't get thrown in jail or some other sort of government sanction.
Yeah.
The First Amendment, really, from an employment situation, you can't disparage your employer on a regular basis with your comments. And a lot of employers do have policies and certain moral guidelines or um, I mean, if an organization has certain goals and you're going to constantly talk down those goals, well, you shouldn't be in that organization, and they have every right to do that.
Hmm.
So, I think that's a good point. A lot of people get confused that somehow your First Amendment right protects you to say anything you want about your employer, about anything else, and really bring disrepute on your employer, and there's no repercussions. That's absolutely not what
Yes,
the First Amendment does. So,
I agree. It doesn't protect you from the consequences, like you said.
exactly. Uh,
Yeah.
The
Yes, I
another
agree.
one, in your own words, explain why diversity is a bad thing, which I think this is because you're trying to get DEI out of
Hmm.
schools.
Yeah. Yeah, when you look at just diversity on its own, of course, it's great to have diverse opinions, the diversity of people involved, and all of that. But where you run into trouble is when you prioritize that and you prioritize those characteristics like race or gender over merit or experience or their viewpoints. You have to judge a person on how well qualified they are for a position, not based on their race, their sex. I mean, that violates the Civil Rights Amendment. That violates, so many laws to judge someone based on that anyways. And that's why President Trump put that out with the executive order. He quoted the Civil Rights Amendment and other issues on why DEI needs to be removed, and diversity is used that way in DEI. So
Yeah, I think
that's
the
why
important
that
point.
can be a
Yeah,
bad thing.
I think an important point you just mentioned it sort of briefly about diversity of opinion. Well, when
Hmm.
actually the DEI we're talking about usually doesn't like diversity of
No.
opinion. It actually
Hmm.
almost assumes that people from certain races and cultures are going to have a certain point of view, uh,
Yes.
and when they don't, it's almost like they're not accepted. Or you
Yes,
could
and
have
that
a
even goes
diverse,
to the inclusion part too. You
yeah.
only include the echo chamber of that same thought.
Or exactly, say they say, "Oh, we've got a diverse group because we have a bunch of immutable characteristics that are different,
Hmm.
but they all have the same opinion." That's not
Yes.
really a very diverse group when um, um, when you look at it. And it's the same question with equity. Explain why equity
Hmm.
is a bad thing.
Equity is a word that has almost been transposed with equality. A lot of people think that equity means equality and they use equity instead of equality. And equity means and you're using methods to come up with the same outcome regardless of whether that person earned that outcome. Equality means you open up the opportunity for each person to succeed, but then it's on them to move forward with that. And it's a big difference than trying to arrange the outcome, whether it be fair or not or equal. And I
Yeah.
think that's confused by a lot and misused that by others. Like, why is equity a bad thing? And they're thinking of that as equality. And equality is absolutely essential in our society, but it's that equal opportunity.
Yeah, I think that equity being equal outcomes, frankly, can lead to going to the lowest common denominator. If you need equal outcomes, not everyone can achieve at the high level, but theoretically everyone can achieve at the low level. So
Yes.
that's where everything ends up if you want all those equal results. And then
Yeah.
the last one of the group, in your own words, explain why inclusion is a bad thing.
Well, just like when we were talking about diversity, and if you force conformity by creating those echo chambers that restrict free speech with other thoughts, and you prioritize a certain ideological viewpoint, then you actually end up doing the opposite of inclusion. And you exclude others that don't share that same viewpoint. So a lot of people think I've spoke to people about DEI and they look at inclusion and they look at it as far as someone who may have an IEP or may be disabled and why don't you want to include them? And that's not what we're talking about regarding to DEI. That's it's completely the opposite. So usually once you explain that and the basics of that, people understand that. But even if someone is dead set on really thinking that DEI is the right way to go, that's their ideological belief. The fact is, when you look at the data, since DEI has been instituted, especially regarding education, which is what we're talking about, it doesn't work. The minority outcomes have decreased since this has been front and center and required in certain fields with education. It's done exactly the opposite. So even if we don't agree on ideology, you got to look at the facts, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, I know looking at it from the business perspective, Harvard Business Review looked at it for companies and found that DEI programs were a utter failure and actually
Yeah,
drove people apart. I find it funny
it's
too.
more divisive. Yeah.
Yeah, they use the word inclusion, but yet part of DEI lots of times has affinity groups, which if people don't know what an affinity group is, it's basically you can make like clubs based on whether you're black or Asian
Hmm.
or LGB or something like that, which is really exclusionary in
It is.
keeping those like people together versus just having a debate club where everyone
Yeah.
participates in.
It's the opposite of how far we've come over the years.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
now this next one's a little long. I'll brief. Please explain to us how the country was built. Specifically, include references to how the white colonists did everything from all the manual labor to build the White House, the universities, and the economic structure. My understanding, this was the person who did the questioning, is that the majority of how the U.S. was built to become a world leader was on the backs of enslaved Africans working for free. So, what's your
Yeah.
response to?
Well, I love this question for one reason. It pretty much describes CRT in the question and the effects of CRT and the way of looking at our history. Again, if you look at the country through that CRT Marxist lens, that's why this is so dangerous. Our country, of course, does have a history of slavery, as others do, which was horrible. But should the focus be on that? Or should it be on how our country has worked so hard to eliminate that? And now with CRT and questions like this, they want to focus on and claim that America is inherently racist, when actually, as we have overcome that, it's the greatest country in the world. It has the greatest opportunity for minorities. It has the greatest opportunity for women. It has the greatest opportunity pretty, than any other place. So what this does, it focus on that, and that is because they want to divide. That's the whole goal of the Marxist, ideology, and that's what you get. You get questions like this that focus on that instead of the positive aspects. So I think that should be the focus because otherwise it's so divisive, and we are all Americans.
Yeah, when I read this, and I think it is like a failure of schools these days, and I think it
Hmm.
comes from stuff like this. That I read a stat once that like one third of the people in the United States think slavery was particular or unique to the United States, when slavery has existed in every culture all over the world since the dawn of time, and unfortunately, is still going on today.
Yes,
Native
with the
Americans,
Uyghurs in China
yeah,
and
yeah, it wasn't the Europeans that brought slavery to America. Native Americans had slaves before they came. It's
yes,
usually if you won the war, you made the other people your slaves, type of thing. And it's unfortunate, but conquest and things like slavery is a human condition that's existed since the dawn of time. I think what makes the U.S. unique is, well, we didn't get rid of it first. We wanted the earlier folks to get rid of it,
hmm,
and then us in the United Kingdom actually fought against the slave trade, one of the few countries that actually spent resources going around the globe trying to get rid of it
yes.
afterwards. So I think, you know, those are the contexts that I think we're lacking in the schools these days because of what really leads to a question like this. And to understand our history was made by everybody, and both the slaves who built it and both those settlers who risked going across the country and exploration and everything else. So
Yes, yeah, that's the perfect example. And a question like that shows how that ideology is divisive and hurts America. It doesn't help. And you're still teaching the true history,
yeah, you're
but
not
that's what you hear a lot. Teaching
pulling
the
any
true history, but
punches.
they leave out that.
But the lesson of that history is nobody's perfect.
Yeah,
It's not unique to one race or to one group of people or anything else. It's just the human condition that
yes,
that we're working against. So okay, this other
completely agree.
one is trying to get into maybe a little financial backing or lobbying. Have you
Mhm.
received financial backing in any form from political or otherwise from groups such as Moms for Liberty or the 1776 Project?
Yeah, that
I think those are two
so
great groups,
far.
by the way.
Yeah, I do too. And I think that's the root of that question. But so far, it's raised. I've only been endorsed by the 1776 Project. I've not received any financial donations. Typically, what they do when I was endorsed by them at a local level, sometimes they'll put out mailers for the candidates that they endorse, but they don't donate directly to your campaign account. But like I said, I think the true reason for that question was to kind of disparage those organizations. And I am very proud of the work that Moms for Liberty does and the 1776 Project PAC. So I am honored to be endorsed by them, and I'm not ashamed of that.
So, next question is, do you believe that your experience as a parent allows you to decide which books should be banned in schools? And then it goes on to say, talking about how librarians and others have spent their
Hmm.
careers looking and evaluating books. So, any
Yeah.
response to that?
And that is true. They have, and unfortunately, on a lot of school board levels, they're no longer using that experience. They're using companies to vet a lot of books and when I say that, like a large group of books at a time, because there is time constraints to go through each book. So these companies bundle a lot of books together and say these are age appropriate without eyes actually on each individual book. But getting back to calling them banned books, libraries and schools do not contain every book. Financially, that's not possible. And because they don't contain each book, that doesn't mean that they're banned. Um, Local boards have a duty to monitor what books are purchased by usually their librarian, and then that comes to them to approve. And they are obligated to make sure that you have the most educationally beneficial books and age appropriate for the tax dollars that they're spending. And you just can't purchase every book. It doesn't mean that a book is banned. If a parent wants to buy that book or check that book out from a public library, they can do that on their own time. But as a district or using taxpayer dollars, you need to make sure that those materials are appropriate. And unfortunately, some just aren't. But there's a lot of books, even if they aren't what I might agree with is age appropriate, just do not contain any educational benefits. So you need to look at that. And it's not banning books. They like to call that because they know a lot of people don't approve of that. But the fact is there's only so many education dollars you can spend. And you also have to look not only at the libraries, but the private personal libraries that teachers have in their classrooms. So teachers, boards, and even the state board, they do have an obligation to make sure that those financial dollars are spent correctly and that you have appropriate materials. Because if you've seen some of these, they can get pretty bad.
Yeah, yeah, and the age appropriateness is always or not always, but an issue that I've looked at a lot. But it's really a common sense point. But you just brought it up too.
Hmm.
Is you do only have so much money, and it's like, you know, what are you going to spend it on? Which books are you going to spend it on to get the biggest bang for your buck from an
Yeah.
educational standpoint? And that is something that really needs to be looked at. This last one, this is the last one from that group that actually came from that earlier comments. Do you
Hmm.
recognize that parents already have the individual ability to contact the school and their child goes to and let them know that their child shouldn't read a particular book or even books?
Yes, they can do that. And as far as like, in fact, this brings up an important Supreme Court ruling recently on being able to opt out of certain curriculum. But unfortunately, even just this last month locally, a policy put out as a recommendation from the Kansas Association of School Boards does not say that districts will honor that when parents request for those books to not be allowed to be checked out or to be able to opt out of a curriculum. The policy they recommended said that districts may. And if you know anything about legalese, shall
Yeah.
and may are completely different, right? So, like our local school board here, a member tried to change that to shall because parents have that constitutional right to direct the upbringing and education of their children, right? And the Supreme Court
Yep.
has upheld that. But here we go again with KSB and their policy, and that may is very important. And a lot of districts just adopt these policies that are recommended by KSB and rubber stamp those through. And that's a very important distinction between may and shall. And I expect there may be court cases come up with that
Okay.
locally.
So that exhausts the questions that we had from those pre-comments that we had. I see, Ed, we've got a couple of questions that came on the comments tonight.
Yeah, the first one is Stephanie Pierce. She wants to know, what do you think about requiring efficiency audits for the districts asking their communities for more money via bonds?
That's a good question. As is across the country, in Kansas, almost every district is facing declining enrollment. So when these bonds are taken out, they're looking forward at their with their current enrollment, right? And how this will affect the taxpayer because they receive funding based on that enrollment. So if you're approving a bond to go out for 20 years with declining enrollment, that responsibility, if that enrollment declines, is going to be placed on the taxpayer. And I take that very seriously because those bonds will still have to be paid. And several districts across the state over the last 2 years have put forth bonds even though their enrollment is declining. And what happens is that application gets sent to the state board that they want to flow a bond, right? And those are always approved. They're never not approved so far. So what's the point of the approval? It's a rubber stamp. Now, we did have a few state board members vote against some of those recently, but the majority did not. And what that tells me is they're just getting rubber stamps. So what I would like to require is some sort of an efficiency audit because right now each district, they do comply with an annual audit, but that audit just shows that the district has received so much money that year and they have spent this much money appropriately. You know, nobody's taking money, embezzling money, whatever. It's being spent on education, right? But it doesn't show that you got from point A to point B in the most efficient manner. So this would show that the district has looked at things, and if there's savings that could be identified, they're going to go down that avenue first before taking it to the voters for a bond.
Okay, I think that answer is yes. So,
Yeah, sorry, that's a long way to say yes. I feel very strongly about that.
Okay, the next question is from Kirsten Workman. Looks like she's running for office also, USD 469. And she asks, what can you propose at the state level to promote greater accountability for at risk funding?
That's a great question. That goes back to the main duties of the state school board, and that is to enforce state laws that are already in place. And we have a state law that at-risk funding can only be spent on at-risk students, right? So say like you receive $2,000 extra per student at your district because you have a high number of at-risk students, right? By law, you shouldn't be just dumping that 2,000 into the general budget and using that for all kids. You shouldn't be buying a curriculum that's used for, say, all of the second grade. That's supposed to go just to those at-risk kids, and it's not right now. And the state board is not enforcing that or applying any penalty for districts that don't. And I feel like that's why, even though at-risk funding has increased over the years, those students' proficiency has not. And that's a very important role of the state board.
so okay. Well, we'll keep a lookout if we get any more online. We have a couple more of
Okay,
the questions that we had come up
sure.
with. The state, and this is a question coming from our Manhattan, the state recently inflated the scoring on the state assessments.
Mhm.
Basically, they changed how they did those cutoffs. So it made it look like, wow, everyone did this dramatic improvement in their assessments. And it's really because they just changed where the goalposts are.
Yeah,
What's your reaction or position regarding this change?
sure. That comes back kind of to that same important duty that I said as far as enforcing state laws. The legislature put forth the blueprint for literacy, right? And they set parameters of improvement that they needed to see on a district level, 2 years out, 4 years out, 5 years out, right? They set those goalposts. And then the following year, the state board came and lowered those standards and changed those. So, for instance, they want the improvement in literacy to jump to 50% by a certain time frame, right? By lowering those standards, it automatically jumped by about 15% overnight. And I even seen at a local level as a school board member, principals coming in and talking to us about student achievement and touting those increases. And we're like, wait a second, those standards were lower. That didn't happen. That may look good on paper, but it doesn't help the students when they graduate. And that's why we have ACT scores that don't match what the Kansas state assessments are showing. And the NAEP, which is a national testing at fourth and eighth grades that you can compare to other states, that's why our Kansas standards don't match with that. And what you end up with is graduates, even some, I've had parents that their students have a 4.0, they graduate, they go to college, and suddenly they're needing to take remedial math, remedial English to be able to take their regular college courses. Or the ACT scores aren't matching. And some people claim, well, like, because the ACT scores have declined, right, since 2018. It used to be that 32% of our graduates were considered proficient on ACT score. Now it's down to 17%. And one argument you'll hear is, well, we have more kids taking the test because it's required for all students to take it. But to me, that's an excuse. You want all kids to do well. We need to know how all kids are doing, right? So that is a mute point for me. And to me, those are indicators on just how important the lowering of those standards are. And that would be one of my first priorities to put those back where they should be.
Yeah, I think people really need to understand that Kansas changed those standards, so we look like we're jumping 15,
Hmm.
20 points on things. Yet if you look at the ACT or that NAP, which is the national test
Hmm.
scores, we're still at that lower end like we always have been. We haven't
Yes.
progressed at all. So really, we're just fooling ourselves with these standards. And I know we've had some on our local school board at 383 saying, "Oh no, but this is it's much better. This is it was wrong before." And it's like, I don't think so. You know,
No, it
you're
wasn't wrong.
still low
In
on
fact, the NAEP it stayed standard.
the NAEP. You're
Or
still low. ACT, you're still low. Why are you
mhm,
changing this internal one? So, yeah, a little
that's
frustration
right.
on
In
my
fact,
point.
we have more Kansans on the night now that are below reading proficient than that are proficient. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, and that's one thing we hear of. That's actually was one of my last questions here is we often hear about the literacy crisis in Kansas and that we're just getting, people graduating that can't read.
Yeah,
And that's one of the things we need to get after. I think we got a
yeah.
couple more from the comments section.
Vanessa Reed asks, what differentiates you, Amy, from the
Hmm.
current state Board of Education members?
Well,
One
I
was they
feel
voted
like,
for these lower standards. So
yeah, obviously they voted for that. And I've also, when I've spoken to some of the other the current board members, they're not big on holding any of the local districts accountable for accreditation. I think I mentioned that earlier. Right now, that's one of the main tools that the state board has is they could pull that accreditation or put a school on probation as far as that goes, but they don't. So really, why do we even have accreditation? If everybody has it, it's no measure, then it's meaningless. That reminds me of the graduation percentages. It's been a huge focus on increasing the percentage of graduates of the high school, right? But if those graduates are not proficient enough to be able to take a college class or proficient enough to be able to go into a trade, like in high school, say like they want to go the technical route and they want to go into, say, cosmetology, and they want to do that their junior and senior year in high school. They have to pass first a reading proficiency exam. And there's so many kids who can't do that. So to me, the difference with me as a candidate, and I'm going to be focused on that. I'm not beholden to bureaucracy. I'm not part of the KSB drinking status quo. Let's just support administrators crowd and keep doing the same thing because nothing's ever going to change. We've had that. We need something different. People can criticize me, but I'm still going to do what's right. I'm still going to work hard and do the research and put in the extra hours. And frankly, I need that because where we're at right now, it's not parents' fault. It's not the teacher's fault. There's a lot of great teachers that are working hard, but it's the administration. It's the bloat. It's the focus on increasing administrators in schools, putting so much funding into that. It's the State Board of Education. It can be the legislature. It can be the Department of Education. That's who's at fault. That's who has to change and support the teachers and support the parents to really make a difference. And
I
I'll
think that's
be fired up for that.
Yeah, I think it kind of says something. I mean, what we were just talking about is that literacy crisis we have in Kansas and kids not being able to read. The fact that we're so low on the ACT and NAP scores that are there, but yet no school has ever lost their accreditation or even be put on a probation.
Yeah,
You
exactly. So it's
Not
meaningless.
that you want that to
It's
happen, but
no, but you have to.
if you never have it happen, it raises the question: is there anything to it?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, and I don't expect that you know. Like, when was the last time any school lost an accreditation or went on a probationary uh, period?
It's an
Uh,
extremely rare occasion. And I believe there was one in the city of Kansas, in Kansas City. And I think it had to do with other issues, not so much their progress as far as these go and adhering to the law. But if we don't make changes in this, the kids are the ones who suffer, right? And the teachers. Like, there's also incidents of classroom disruptions and safety issues. And those need to be addressed too. And the teachers are the ones who are trying to put up with this, and the administration is the one who's just kicking this can down the road. So we have to be strong and we have to address those issues if we're going to make a difference. And if we don't, I mean, Kansas is in a crisis as far as literacy. And if kids are not reading at a grade level by the end of third grade, evidence-based research shows they never catch up. And we right now we socially promote kids. They are just pushed on, and that's a disservice to them. And I hope the legislature and then the state board in conjunction looks at other states. For instance, in 2023, Tennessee changed their social promotion policies where in third grade, if those students, based on their state assessment, are not reading at a proficient level by the end of third grade, they're not promoted to fourth grade. They have the opportunity to do remedial courses over that summer and they could retest and catch up. But if they don't make that, they're not promoted on. And it sounds harsh, but it's actually better for the students because from then on, they're reading and they have to use retention on everything they learn. And if they're not reading at that level, then they never catch up. And we have kids graduating, like you said, that can't read or not read well, not at a proficient level, and then they can't move on. And they're focused right now at the state board on those high school graduation percentages. But it's just like the accreditation, if there's no consequence, it kind of makes it worthless. So if we're going to push these students through just so they graduate, but they're not competent, that turns the graduation diploma into an attendance certificate, right? These
Participation
kids,
certificate.
yeah, or participation. It doesn't do them any favors, and it does a disservice to the students who have put in the work. And then even those kids who, like I mentioned earlier, are performing well. Why do we have kids that have a 4.0 that are scoring poorly on an ACT? That doesn't pass the sniff test. Or why are these kids going to college and they need remedial classes? Or why are these kids, they can't pass the reading exam to be able to go into a trade, to become an electrician or a plumber? That's an issue. And so we need to address that, especially as the tech movement has become so strong and kids can go into welding and come out of that program making $80,000 out the door without all that college debt. But if they can't read to get into that program, then they're lost. And we really have to address that. So it all boils down to reading and reading proficient by third grade. And that's why that blueprint for literacy is so key. And lowering those standards, it's just done the opposite to how that would be effective.
I
Right.
just did a quick search about the last time that a state lost school
Hmm.
lost accreditation or school district, and tell me if this sounds correct. This is just from search results, but it says that Kansas rarely yanks accreditation from a school district. They do something called conditionally accredited, where they
Yes,
are subject to stricter state oversight. And I guess some of the recent ones is in 23 and 2024. The Kansas City USD 500, Hayesville
yes,
USD 261, Otis Bison USD 403, and Brewster 314 were subject to conditional accreditation, which meant that they were under increased state oversight. But yeah, there's no instances of anybody losing accreditation.
exactly. Yeah, that was, I remembered the USD 500 district, and that's just it. Now, I'm not saying you go straight into removing their accreditation. I could see why you have that probationary to correct issues, but you still have to follow up if that's not done. It's kind of like another situation I found as a local school board member is the state board monitors licensing of teachers, right? So if you have teachers at a district that are not working with a valid teacher's license, they kick back this report to the local district and it lets them know you have three teachers and their license isn't good for whatever reason. Maybe it expired, maybe they never received it. They could have started on a provisionary license or a temporary sub license and never moved forward with that. So we've got a great starting point. They send that report. The district looks at it, they can ignore it because there's no consequence from the state board if they don't take care of that. There's no follow up, there's no threat of losing your accreditation. So instead, what we had on a local level was a teacher being able to continue working for over 3 years without a valid license. And you would think that would be something the KNEA would be fired up about that too, because they're supposed to represent those teachers. And you have teachers that are working hard that have their license and maintain that license, and then you have someone being paid that same amount without a valid license. So I wish they would get involved on that too. But that's another avenue at the state board that I want better scrutiny and a consequence if the district doesn't comply, because without consequences, as we've seen, behaviors are not likely to change.
Well, uh, this is somewhat related to what you were just talking about. No one else has addressed this, and I'm just curious.
Hmm.
My hometown, Chicago, this is the big issue. What role do teachers' unions play here in Kansas, and how do they interact with the state school board? And what do you think
Yeah.
about all of that?
Well, it's not quite as bad as Chicago, but that's not exactly a high bar, is it? Unfortunately. Um, but they are very involved. They're involved in local races for school board members. They're down at Topeka testifying on almost every education bill. Um, they not only represent teachers in litigation or negotiating for their contract, but they're very active in legislation as working as lobbyists down there. But one thing that's very disappointing to me as far as their influence, if you just happen to Google KNEA on any given day and look at their platform or look at what they're focused on, it's rarely student achievement, teacher working conditions, teacher pay, things like that. Instead, you're going to find LGBTQ issues, how to support safe places. Most recently was ICE walkouts, and they were supporting teachers wearing blue in support of anti-ICE walkouts. Now, that should not be the
So were
priority
they
of a
truancy
teachers union.
promoters?
I'm sorry.
Were they truancy promoters?
Yes, they were. They were. And in fact, that brings up another I can't remember now, I'm sorry if I mentioned it, but on the budget bill there's an amendment that wants to add a consequence for districts encouraging or allowing these student walkouts because down in Johnson County, we actually had a student that was injured in one of those. There was no parental permission for those walkouts, and they are truant. You know, they're not in school. They're missing classroom time. There's no parental permission. So this amendment requires parental permission to be given for any type of walkout like this. And if it is not, those districts would be held accountable by a potential fine given by the state board equal to what their superintendent pay is. And I think he chose that superintendent pay because that kind of is geared around the size of the district. So, for instance, our local district here, if they allowed this walkout without parental permission, if this would go through this amendment, then the school could potentially be fined $185,000. And unfortunately, sometimes that financial impact is the only thing they listen to. But again, when you looked, I couldn't believe that the KNU was promoting this and wanting teachers to be activists in classrooms when we have a literacy crisis in Kansas, and that's what we need to be focused on.
Well, and I
Yeah, and
think
for,
also that the day of the walkout would not count towards hours that are required for the
Yes,
year. Yeah.
and that's a state law that they have to, you know, attend that many hours, and they're losing out.
We have another question. Dustin
Sure.
is asking, well, he says he keeps hearing about Kansas doesn't fully fund special education. About how much would it cost to actually do that? What I mean, if we were to fully
Mhm.
fund special education, what would it cost the taxpayer? And then he's also concerned that it might turn out to be a blank check for, basically like in Minnesota, people
Mhm.
abusing the taxpayers' money by saying that
Yeah.
they have autism when they don't.
Well, the funding formula, I'll admittedly say, is quite a mess, but they are looking at redoing that formula now for starting in 2027. But the fact that a lot of people claim that SPED is not fully funding not fully funded is not accurate. And even Governor Kelly, who I'm not always a fan of, you Google her right now, you'll see she says schools are fully funded. And so that is a myth that has been portrayed often. And one thing that is not considered in that those tallies of numbers, whether it's fully funded, is that the state also funds the school for the blind, the school for the deaf. They don't usually include those numbers in that funding. And also, a lot of districts are saying that they have to pull money out of their general fund to cover SPED. But SPED is one of those areas that I feel every district should do a forensic or a efficiency audit of SPED because I'm not saying that we should deny services to those students at all. Don't misunderstand. But say like you have to provide services for a student that has an IEP. There's a difference in providing services with just writing a blank check for contracting out services, doing it however you want because it's the law. We need to provide these services. We have a moral duty to provide them. So, unfortunately, a lot of districts just say we can't scrutinize this. But you can figure out which way to do it in the most efficient manner. And I've attended a lot of trainings across the country as far as budgeting with school districts, and SPED is one of those areas that they find the most significant savings. So again, I think if we just wrote a blank check to SPED, they would just continue to spend and not properly allocate those funds, I'm sorry. And I think that another avenue that should be explored and already is used by some districts is pairing resources with surrounding districts. Here locally, we used to have a co-op where we would share services with the district next to us, right? So they may have two or three kids that needs an expert in a certain area, and we may have two or three, but for us each to contract out for that would cost so much more. If we share that and hire one individual to provide those services, that's at a much lower rate than say $80, $90 an hour to contract out. And that's what I see. When I'm a local school board member, and the consent agenda every month would be contract after contract to piecemeal out all of your sped to different services at a rate that would be almost double what it would cost to have an employee do that.
So
So I think that should be a focus.
cool. Well, I think Ed, I think we hit all the comment questions. We exhaust our list here. So I'll give you a chance to sum things up, Amy, and just tell people right now. Well, the last time I checked the Secretary of State's website, you're the only one for District 1 at this current time, but we
That
still
does
have
help, doesn't
we still have till June. And
it?
and so if someone else does get throw their hat in the ring, we'll get them on and talk to them as well. But why don't you sum things up and before we say goodnight and say why should people vote for Amy Cawvey?
Sure. Well, like I mentioned earlier, I'm a fighter. I'm going to stand strong. I have a vast amount of knowledge regarding this, and I'm willing to work with legislators. I'm willing to help and stand strong in upholding state laws. But most of all, I'm really going to fight hard for Kansans. We're at a critical time, and our students are our future, and we have to invest all we can in that. And I would encourage you, you can look at my website if you have more questions. It's amycawveyforkansas.com. I have a Facebook page, Amy Cawvey for Kansas. On both of those, I've listed my personal cell phone number, my email. You can text me, call me. I'm willing to meet with you. I'm willing to come out to your area and talk to your group if you would like. Ask any questions you would like, because full transparency has always been one of my mottos. And I would maintain that once I'm in office, and I won't cave to the administrative power, overreaching powers that have kind of influenced how policy is made. If you are happy with, more students not being proficient in reading and not being college ready, then maybe you want to keep moving forward with the status quo. But if you think Kansas needs to change, we need to increase our standards, hold ourselves to a higher level of accountability, and you want someone that's not going to cave once they get into office, then I would hope that you would look at me and contact me with any questions, and I'm open to that
Okay,
anytime.
great. Thanks a lot, Amy. Thanks, Ed, for producing tonight. For those folks out there, we're going to be looking at getting other candidates for various
Mhm.
positions on our Manhattan. And feel free to message us if you have any suggestions on anyone for us to bring on, or if you want to come on, message to us and we'll see what we can do. Thank you all, and